Good evening. I'm Chuck Trey Montana, the moderator for this, the second of a trilogy of reenactment programs entitled Quests for America's Freedoms. Each presentation will focus on a colonial patriot or patriots who laid the very foundations for the freedoms and liberties that are now the heart and soul of our American freedoms. This evening, October 23rd, 2024, our guest patriots will be President John Adams and First Lady Abigail Smith Adams. On Wednesday, November the 20th, 2024, our guest patriot will be Paul Revere. Before we begin this evening's presentation, I would like to give due credit to our two reenactors, or as they prefer to be known as interpreters. First Lady Abigail Smith Adams will be portrayed by Audrey Stuck Gerard. Audrey is a Boston-based living history interpreter and has been portraying Abigail Smith Adams and other revolutionary personas for over a decade. Her business, called Cuffed and Quaffed, creates and performs educational programs. Audrey also creates custom wigs with historically accurate hairstyles. President John Adams will be portrayed by Michael LePage. Michael has been a historical interpreter since 1993, first starting by portraying Revolutionary and Civil War soldiers. He currently portrays President John Adams, Paul Revere, and Dr. Joseph Warren. Michael has performed at the Adams National Historical Park, the Paul Revere House, and the John F. Kennedy Library Museum. And now for our official program. Welcome to our guest for Quest for America's Freedoms. The year is 1804, and you are about to meet President John Adams, the second President of these United States, and First Lady Abigail Smith Adams. They have graciously allowed us to visit with them in their home in Quincy, Massachusetts, and also given us the privilege of reviewing some of their personal correspondence and diplomatic papers for discussion. Please stand now and welcome President John Adams and First Lady Abigail Adams.
We expanded the house. This is a great number of guests.
Well, I'm sure you're quite used to entertaining at the White House, and I'm sure you're going to do very, very well. How was your trip down? 2 rooms. How was your recent trips and travels?
Oh, well, I've been very grateful to be staying home quite a lot more lately. Since Mr. Adams left the presidential office, we have finally ceased being apart from each other for the first time in many, many, many years.
That's interesting. I have read that you have been apart for about 35% of your first 20 years of marriage.
Oh, I hadn't done calculations on
I
it.
have not either, but it is true.
It feels right, certainly.
Well, that's one way to keep peace in the family, I assume.
Oh, no. For us, things are much more turbulent when we're not together. It's
Indeed.
Really, the two of our minds working in tandem, I would say, is far more of a useful tool.
I must add to that two very brilliant minds that are well respected in the community, certainly. If I may, I'd like to start with some of your ancestry because it is so incredibly interesting. John, your first Adams to these colonies was 1638, I believe. Henry Adams.
Henry Adams, yes.
Yes. And he's known as the father of New England. For what reason?
Well, it's funny you should say that, sir, because I think that might have to do with 89 grandchildren. There is an Adams in every part of New England, I would guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Certainly. Mrs. Adams, your family goes back to Quincy's very prominent family, way back, what, 1638?
Yes, certainly. My mother was born Elizabeth Quincy and married Reverend Smith, my father.
Mm-hmm.
So the Quincy line does run strong in our family, and my mother was quite proud of it as well. Not in a boastful way, but to take pride in where you're from and the good, respectable family in which I've been raised.
Wonderful. Your father was Quaker minister? No, excuse me, not Quaker minister, Congregational minister.
Yes, thank you for the correction.
Quite
It
all
is
right.
very
Quite
important.
all right. Congregational minister, trained at Harvard. Of course, Harvard being the school for training ministers at that time. And he had a very extensive library, and he taught you almost from the day of you were born for you to have an independent mind and speak your mind as well.
Well, certainly he allowed that to be kindled within me, as did my mother. I would say that my primary teacher early on was, in fact, my grandmother, Elizabeth Quincy, sorry. I spent a great amount of time with her growing up on Mount Wollaston. I spent long durations of time if I stayed with her for summers. And she was the one to do my reading and my early writing, teaching, learning Bible verses, a little bit of arithmetic. And unfortunately, that is truly all of the normal schooling most girls get in America, which is very sad state,
Yes, it is.
at least to have the literacy, but to cease simply at the very basics is to crush a flower just as it's beginning to bloom. There is so much potential in anyone, male or female, to rise to greater things and serve their country and their community more if you allow them to have a better education. Everyone is snickering at me. I think I might be getting carried away already.
Certainly not. I would just point out to all of you that is it no wonder that I did not listen to my cabinet when I was President of the United States and listen to Mrs. Adams? Do you not agree? I was a wise decision on my part.
And Mrs. Adams, your father's library was very extensive, I understand, and
Yes.
you learned to quote Shakespeare and Milton at an early age.
Absolutely. So I did have a younger brother as well, so my brother William was able to receive a little more advanced schooling, not to be sent away for school, but to be taught by local school masters and teachers, and I benefited a bit from what he was learning. But my sisters and I, my older sister Mary and my younger sister Elizabeth and I, and our cousins, our friends, all of our adolescent social group really did take advantage of large libraries or really any reading material we could get our hands on. And we would write to each other if we read something particularly stirring and send along the pamphlet or the book and say, oh, Cousin Isaac, you must take...
You were a phenomenal letter writer. That goes without saying. Mr. Adams,
Yes.
Your father was well known in the community. He was a deacon of the local church, a farmer, a yeoman farmer. That means he was able to support the family on the farm.
Made shoes in the winter, sir. Made shoes in the winter.
And made shoes during the winter.
Did indeed.
And he made absolutely certain that all his sons went to Harvard.
Well, certainly I was the one that was intended, which is odd, which if I could share a little story with you of my youth.
Please.
I was not a lover of books as a boy, it was thought by father. He was most concerned that as a young boy, you've heard the story many times.
I have, yes.
I was out of doors. I was hunting, I was fishing, I was shooting marbles with the other boys, skating in winter months, swimming in the summer, floating boats upon the water, and father grew concerned because as the oldest, I was the one who was indeed the one who was supposed to go to Harvard College. And we had a meeting, and I told him, it was as if I was not minding him. And I said, I wish to be a farmer, Father, much as you are. He said, want to be a farmer? I will show you what it is to be a farmer. And he took me down to the creek bed, and we gathered up thatch. And at the end of a long day of hard work, and being a bit obstinate, you might have noticed that in my presidency, and before that, and Mrs. Adams certainly knows that I have an obstinate bent of mind when I want to, I said that I liked it very much. after he asked me if I liked being a farmer, and he said, well, I do not like it, so you will go to school. And then we came to an agreement, because it was nothing about books. It was not that I detested books. In fact, I loved them. It was I did not like my teacher. And Joseph Marsh became my teacher and prepared me properly for Harvard College, and I developed a love of learning that still is with me today.
You entered Harvard when you were 16.
Indeed.
It is said that you went in actually to become a minister and you came out a lawyer.
Well, as Mrs. Adams knows, I have a gift for talk. And it was discovered in college then, and Father had wanted me to be a minister, but can you imagine, good people? Can you imagine Parson Adams on the pulpit every Sunday? I was better suited for harangues in the courtroom than I was on the pulpit. And there was a good deal of politics involved in being the parson of a town. But of course I would find out that there is politics in everything.
Yes, you didn't really escape that by
I
going
did not.
into a legal career, Mr. Adams.
I'd like to make a note that you first met Abigail. She was 15 and you were 24. Her father wasn't exactly pleased about the relationship, I understand. He thought lawyers' prospects are inadequate.
Well, there are some cases where that is true, I am sure.
You certainly proved him wrong.
Well, not with my first case, sir, I did not.
No.
Lambert versus Field, to you lawyers that have come to visit us this evening, just a recommendation not to get involved in town affairs if you're going to be taking up a case. It may not end well, as mine did not. I lost my first case.
I should point out, though, that Mr. Adams spent many more years wooing me over to his side than he did my father. When we first met, you were not fond of me.
Well,
Oh, really?
No,
That's
no.
not noted.
young and foolish. Young and foolish.
Yes, when I was a very young woman, we first met when John's friend Richard Cranch, who married my sister Mary, is now a very dear brother-in-law to the family. Mr. Cranch was calling on Mary and bringing a friend around for the social visits, and so Mr. Adams was in our house, and we all had tea and discussion together, and you found the Adams girls were not
Oh dear.
Oh, yeah.
not quite silent enough, I think I should say. I believe you'd said we were... my impression is that we were perhaps a little too witty, catching some of your weaker spots. Perhaps you felt a bit...
I was young and still making my way in the world, so I was not always sure of myself, and perhaps that came out from time to time.
And I never was a good one at being silent, and my sisters and I really do tend to push each other on to be outspoken about things. I wouldn't be anywhere near as vocal as I am were it not for Mary and Elizabeth prompting me to be so.
So after, I won't call it a lengthy courtship, but you were married in 1764.
Yes.
October.
October, okay. But by 1770, Mr. Adams, you became a very prominent, probably the most prominent lawyer in Boston.
Well, I
For a
overcame
couple of
it.
cases in particular, but
Indeed. Well, you speak of the massacre on King Street.
yes.
Well, there had been a number of incidents 5 years before, leading up to that terrible night, where there was mob violence in the streets. And my concern was that our cause, our fight for our liberty, was going to be viewed as nothing more than mob violence in the streets of Boston, and that these soldiers, though they should not have been sent here, deserved to be treated as other English subjects, whether they be here in Massachusetts, whether they be in England. They had the right to good representation and a fair trial, and they received both. I consider it one of the finest moments of my legal career, sir, in defending those soldiers, though I worried of Mrs. Adams and the children, because we were living in Boston at that time, and my office was in Boston.
It was an unpopular decision, viewed by many of our neighbors at the time. Luckily, we didn't suffer anywhere near the blows of anger that some of the more loyalist of our neighbors received at the time, but nonetheless, we were raising our young family. I was, at the time of the incident, expecting our son Charles to be born, and had also recently grieved the loss of our daughter Susanna earlier that winter. And so it was a difficult time to be slightly more in the public eye and also in a bit of a more dangerous place.
Dangerous relationship. But the most positive aspect was that the soldiers were found innocent.
All but 2 were found not guilty, and those 2 because of evidence in court, and I managed to save their lives. They could have been found guilty of murder. They were not. They were found guilty of manslaughter, and I pleaded benefit of clergy, an old ecclesiastical law from medieval times. That was a literacy test. Fortunately, neither of them had to read, and they were indeed still found guilty, but they were merely branded on the thumbs. But the important thing that came out of that, for me, was that we had, in this colony of Massachusetts at the time, the province of Massachusetts had a fair murder trial, and you would have thought that it had never occurred with the reception back in England for Parliament. It was as though it never happened. They did not see that the courts were effective here. And of course, in the years to come, they would take away many of the privileges of our courts.
Excuse me. 1774, you were selected to attend the Continental Congress. Mrs. Adams, you were left alone to manage the family farm with hired hands. Now, you had no slaves.
Correct.
Your feelings about slavery?
Of course, my feelings as an adult when regarding the state of slavery is absolute abhorrence. I do have to own that growing up, my father's family did own slaves. And in fact, my father was an enslaver until his death in 1783. At which point, the remaining slaves that he had were freed. And one of them, in fact, who was one of the enslaved people at my father's house growing up, Phoebe, has remained a very dear person in our lives ever since. She has, as a paid employee, helped run my dairy. She watched our house at the foot of Penn's Hill the entire time we were in Europe, and has almost stepped into my shoes a bit when I was away in that way. Phoebe has been dear with us this entire time. But as for my own beliefs, and as for our own family and our own household, no, we have never owned slaves, nor have we ever condoned such. I find it to be the greatest sin of humanity, and really the blackest mark on the American story. I fear that any of the dangers, any of the trials that have fallen on this land have come as a judgment from God for that terrible, terrible sin. And
It's definitely, and I noticed the differences. And we will continue to have differences with our fellow countrymen in the middle colonies and especially the southern colonies then and states now. When I went to that first Congress, when we were colonies, I saw these elegantly dressed men from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And when they spoke, and I would see their hands, and I would see that I would comment to the others at our delegation, I do not think that man has ever pruned a tree in his life, or worked a plow, or mended a stone wall as I have, alongside our hired hands. It's, when the day I leave this world, I will be John Adams, husband, father, lawyer, statesman, but more simply farmer. I will always think of myself as a farmer. And I wrote many a letter to you about how I miss you and the children and the farm in my books. A reoccurring theme.
So now at the Continental Congress, about 1776, you're working with Jefferson and Franklin, writing the Declaration of Independence.
Indeed, how relationships change over time, do they not, sir? And Mrs. Adams.
And
In those days, Mr. Jefferson was a dear, dear friend.
One of the bright ones of creation.
Indeed. And of course, there are stories regarding who would write the Declaration. Now, I am, as I grow older, have perhaps thought that the story might have been said differently by myself and Mr. Jefferson, but clearly, whether I thought him a superior writer to me or not, a Virginian had to write it, much as a Virginian had to command the army. So that was why Mr. Jefferson wrote the Declaration, while Dr. Franklin and I specifically were editors, shall we say.
oh, editors, all right. All right. Mrs. Adams, you did not hesitate to write to Mr. Adams to let him know your opinions on certain subjects, and I want to thank you for allowing me to read some of your correspondence in advance of this meeting. Would you mind reading your correspondence to Mr. Adams dated March 31st, 1776?
Mrs. Adams, are you comfortable sharing our correspondence?
Well, you know, John, I hope that all of my letters will be burned when I go, so...
Not a chance.
Let's see, so March 31st, 1776, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And, by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
I did respond, you know.
It did strike me so. While this incredible opportunity was being taken for you to construct a new identity for the nation, a new founding document to form independence, to form the United States, my goodness, the potential that was in front of these delegates, not only to represent their own peers, the men who voted alongside of them or farmed or did mercantile business, but the entire other half of the population of the earth, to take into consideration honestly the binds that have tied women for decades, for all of time. And I really did want to encourage you, and I'm sure you did, to the best of your ability. I hope you did, to the best of your ability.
Of course I did. But I remind you that while all of this was being exchanged, I was verbally jousting with men such as John Dickinson and Edward Rutledge of South Carolina.
Yes. There is your, may I call it your rebuttal? Would you like to read that?
I suppose I should share.
I think I remember
Just
this
to
one.
defend myself, if nothing else. April 14th, 1776. As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy, I will not blot it out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know that they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly into practice. And in practice, you know that we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat. I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight.
Uh-oh.
It was meant in jest, sir.
I read the gist of it, and I had started with some manner of jest, but the idea that men should be ever considered the subjects. My dear partner, you are one of the few who has taken the opportunity to have a true partnership in marriage. You can't deny there are so many for whom marriage is a complete separation of the men's world and the woman's world. And inevitably there is an imbalance in the power of that. And clearly, it is on the husbands who control the finances, who control all of the property, who control one's name, one's identity. I've been incredibly blessed to have such a strong, loving, devoted partner who does see my potential and who does take into account and work with me and work together to raise our children, run our household, run our family, our farm, all of this. But one must admit I am favored and fortunate beyond most others in this. With all of that,
Mr. Warren did say that you were a better farmer than I was in a letter, the general.
I did my best. I do see I have my response here, dated May 7th of 1776. I cannot say I think you very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is, like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet.
Bravo. Is it no wonder that I managed to put Mr. Dickinson in his place and get independence passed in the Congress? But may I remind you that there was a great fleet of His Majesty's soldiers and their German mercenaries, up to 30,000 of them, off of the shores of New York. There was no time to waste. We had to compromise, and as I assured you, we can only fight one war at a time. Fighting the British Army, their mercenary friends, and all of their allies, and in Congress, it did get to fighting at one point, verbally, and our wives would be too much for any group of men to be able to
I've often thought,
be victorious in.
yes, I've often thought that all the patriots were marching to the same drummer, but the more I read, I realize they're all marching off in different directions in terms of their determination as to what the new colonies should be.
What was the analogy of, for the moment of choosing, declaring independence, that is, 13 clocks had to be wound to strike midnight at exactly the same moment, all 13.
Indeed.
Different drums, absolutely.
And the fastest must wait for the slowest.
All right, if we might skip ahead a little bit, the year is approximately 1781. Mr. Adams, you've been sent off to Europe.
Again?
And again, probably not for the first time in your years of diplomacy. I was particularly interested in your trip to the Netherlands and how you were able to acquire $2 million to help support Washington's army.
Indeed, a very industrious people, the Dutch. And as far as Europe is concerned, probably the most representative government. And the freest, certainly with a great deal of religious tolerance, though I did become very ill during my time there. Mm-hmm. Very ill. To the point of death, I thought at one point. But, of course, it was most important because, truth be told, sir, I did have my doubts, and they probably go back to the first voyage over to France, about the sincerity of the French government at times. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, they did not listen to me anyway. They were all enamored with Dr. Franklin. But the Dutch were reasonable, and they were the men of finance. So it was most important to be able to negotiate with them and to secure those loans. And of course, being the empire that it was, Great Britain had rivals. That would be the French, that would be the Spanish, and that would be the Dutch. All came to our aid, but none more than the French with troops. and their navy for Yorktown, but certainly without that money from the Dutch banks, we would not have been able to make the payments we needed to.
Yes, I should add that you brought your son Quincy, who was 10 years old at the time, with you to York.
I did, and Charles as well,
And Charles as well.
for the second
yes.
voyage. Imagine going across the Pyrenees from Spain to France on a mule.
Well, I should point out that that was not the intended route of travel, and it was entirely Mr. Adams's decision to take 2 teenage boys with him over the Pyrenees rather than waiting for a ship from Spain up to France.
We did have to get there.
Your choice.
Did have to get there. I did see the country.
No wonder
Not
Charles didn't
comfortably,
last
but I
that
did see
long
the
in
country.
Europe, no.
Then in 1784, Mrs. Adams, you were able to join him with the other children.
Finally.
And Mr. Adams, you rented a 50-room villa with 8 servants.
yes.
Mrs. Adams, you must have been rather overwhelmed moving from a colonial's cottage to a 50-room villa.
We never, well, 50 is an estimate. Everybody who lived there had a different number that they counted of how many rooms
And
there
rooms.
actually were.
Servants few, nearly as many as the other.
I would have wished the
Delegations.
servants were fewer. One of my primary problems moving to Europe was that the servants would do only what their specific job title and duty was for. The archaic structures of your cook will not wash a dish, and your valet would never answer the door, and you have to pay 16 people a full wage just to have a functional house. If you are in New England, whoever is by the door is going to answer the door.
And I believe you told me that you thought the one that was in charge of all of them was stealing anyway.
Yes, and all of them drunk, always, nearly, especially in Philadelphia.
Now, this was a wonderful time in your relationship with Jefferson. He was actually spent a good deal of time at the villa. He taught John Quincy his algebra, worked on his languages. You were exceptionally close.
Indeed.
It was a beautiful time to be an inspiring environment, to be in this era just after the conclusion of the war, to have the satisfaction that our home country was indeed a country, and damaged and weakened as it was by the war, that it was the blooming of a new world. And we were in Europe, absorbing the ideas of the old world. And Mr. Jefferson, as we've all said, brilliant mind, and so these thoughts would percolate both in person and the letters we would write to each other, and it was a very, very dear time.
And I wondered where our dear Johnny had gone many, many days and nights. And where was he? He was with Mr. Jefferson, visiting Mr. Jefferson, dining with Mr. Jefferson, to the point where I said to Mr. Jefferson, I was not sure whether he was my boy or yours.
Well, and then we inherited Mr. Jefferson's daughter, Polly, for a
Indeed.
little while as well. His younger daughter had been left in Virginia when he went to Europe, while he took his older daughter with him. And then while we were living in London, he sent for young Polly to come along with him. And she was so young, and her father had been away so long, that she did not even recognize a picture that I showed of him to her. She wept when leaving the ship because she had grown attached to the ship's captain, because she had been orphaned at home. She'd had her mother die and her father disappeared, had been raised by another relative, then drawn away by a father who she had not in conscious memory met, sent across the ocean, becomes endeared to this one shipping captain, and then is abandoned when the captain has to stay on his ship, and she's in London with this 14-year-old slave girl, Sally Hemings, at her side. And Mr. Adams and I took young Polly in until Mr. Jefferson was supposed to come get her himself. He was supposed to come from France, but instead he sent a servant who spoke only French. And this poor girl, speaking only English, without an adult friend in the world, clinging to me, weeping. Even for a time when I was very endeared to Mr. Jefferson, I have to say that left a very sour taste in my mouth that he would do such a thing.
And it is that type of behavior that I noticed going back to the early days in Congress, that there is a detachment, and perhaps it is because of these large sweeping plantations that they have in the South, and in the middle colonies too, that there sometimes seems to be a lack of closeness, I've noticed, among families, and that certainly relates to that. But we were all together. Almost all of us,
Well-
as a family, the two youngest were not there, but our two oldest were.
Yes.
I might point out 1785, well, the family was all in Europe. You became the first ambassador to Great Britain and to the court of
St. James.
St. James. Quite all right, sir. Quite all right.
St. James,
You,
yes.
you are, I had my own struggle, sir, there. Not necessarily remembering the court, but remembering when to bow. I cannot tell you how many times I was instructed, and I will stay seated because we are talking, but from here to that door, with His Majesty on the other end of the room, I had to bow at the entrance, I had to bow halfway, and then in His royal presence. And then imagine me, John Adams, having to wait for someone else to speak first. Do not speak to His Majesty. He will speak to you, and you will be recognized. Then you may speak. But I did discover one great truth. Actually, two. We had similarities in our likes. Can you imagine? His Majesty, King George III, who I had debated time and time again for separation from, yet we both loved our books. He had a tremendous library. And farming. Can you imagine that? Your description of the audience with His Majesty that I did not attend is still something that makes me chuckle, I would have to say. There is what you said, and there is what you wanted to say.
Well, you see, this was the first time that I was in the presence of King George III. And it was a very large reception, a large room, and the guests all around the exterior of the room. And you had the king went in one direction, and the queen and the princesses went in the other direction. You had to wait for them to go round, and it took about 4 hours for the king to come to me. Of course, I'm not craving an intense conversation or a lengthy audience with the king. If anything, I just want to curtsy and be on my way. It's been 4 hours already. He was kind, the king. He asked if I had been out for a walk today. And my thought was that I had spent all morning getting ready to have an audience with the king and then waiting 4 hours standing by for you to come. So no, I have not been for a walk today. And I said, I have not been for a walk today. And he asked me, Mrs. Adams, why don't you like walking?
He is a bit pathetic. He was.
I made some fast excuse, curtsied, and that was the end of it.
And let it be known that I do have a sense of humor. You might have heard that I am a bit grouchy. You've not found me grouchy this evening, have you? No. Indeed. Well, I'll stay a while, and then perhaps it will happen, much like Congress.
Sip a bit more cider,
Indeed.
It'll ease you.
But Mr. Adams, you and King George did have one thing in common regarding the French.
French?
Yes.
Well, I had difficulties with it, that is for sure.
So did he.
Distaste with the French.
But yes, neither I or His Majesty had mastered it. But I will tell you one thing. Perhaps this is a bit late to be accusing someone of not always saying what they actually were. And I can tell you that Dr. Franklin was not fluent in French either. It did not seem to stop him when he was there from making himself very popular, but I could go on a harangue about Dr. Franklin. But I just got done saying that I do have a sense of humor and I am not grouchy, so I intend, madam, to stay that way.
There you go.
1789, General Washington was elected president, and you were elected vice president,
Indeed.
beating out Jefferson by a very small number of votes at the time. What was it like to be vice president under General Washington?
I still have no idea what the office of vice president actually is for. Could there be a more useless position than being vice president? I, as a lawyer, am subject to desire to debate, to talk. But yet, as vice president convening over the Senate, I could not. But one thing I could do was be the deciding vote, which I did very well. And it was one of those times when the government was first formed that you were away. And I did have a bit of a stumble. We were discussing, well, this is all brand new, ladies and gentlemen. What will we call the president? How will he be addressed? Mr. President? That is it? So my thought was...
Presidents of card-playing clubs.
Indeed.
And local associations. You need a chief executive.
Well, indeed, and that was my point, but it was, dare I say, taken out of context, and perhaps it was because of my experiences in Europe, but I saw nothing wrong with, and it was just a suggestion, mind you, Your Majesty the President of the United States. That's about how it went over in the Senate as well, to the point where one of the senators, I believe it was a Senator McClay, said that he had a title for me. I can poke fun at myself. His rotundity. which I find amusing now, but not then. So, thank God Mrs. Adams came to my rescue and joined me at Richmond Hill.
In 1796, you became president?
I did,
President?
by 3 votes.
By 3 votes over Jefferson, who
Indeed.
became your vice president.
In title only, sir.
In title only. It must have been a difficult relationship because at this time 2 political parties were developing, the Federalist and the Democratic Republican Party. So could you maybe give us a brief definition of the difference between the two?
Oh dear.
As you experienced while you were president.
How much time do they have, Mrs. Adams?
Well, the names came from the period of time, the ratification of the Constitution. So the Federalists being the party that were pro-Constitution, pro-ratifying it,
Indeed.
and then the Republicans were often the anti-Federalist parties. Morphed into each other. And those names carried on even after the Constitution was ratified. So by the time of your presidency, it was the Federalists who were typically more northern, often more business-minded, often more focused in urban centers, and then the Democratic Republicans, very often the wealthy landowners of the South, and then some odd Philadelphia Republicans as well. They're not my favorite, but...
Indeed, and the journalists. Now, I had intended, and first let me say that it was a most difficult act to follow for those of you good people of the theater, to be the second act to George Washington as president. He did get some criticism in his second term, but for the most part, much of that was blamed on me, even though that I was left out of any decision making, and it was all left to that wretched little retired man, and now no longer with us, Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. But that being said, it was my intention, the president by 3 votes, mind you, that I would try to bring both parties together, even though they'd become quite entrenched. I had suggested that since we were now involved in, for all intents and purposes, an undeclared war with France at sea, that perhaps sending another man that was beloved in France, Thomas Jefferson, and we were speaking as friends and not just as president and vice president, that perhaps he could go back to France and he could deal with that new revolutionary government, the Directory, and he said that he had no wish to travel again back over there, and that he was the vice president, it would not look well, and perhaps he was right. And then I suggested that perhaps James Madison of the Congress would go. And of course, James Madison went from Congress to retirement to leader of the party eventually. And he said that he would ask, but he did not think that he would go. And then I did reach out, and as it would turn out, Mr. Madison would not go, that my own ministers of the executive branch, my cabinet, in a loose term, if you will, the Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering of Salem, and James McHenry, our Secretary of War, and Oliver Wolcott Jr., our Secretary of the Treasury, handpicked by Hamilton, mind you, all said that they would resign if I sent Mr. Madison to France, and that it would be sending a Republican that would be more interested in French interests than the interests of this country. What was I to do? I not only endured politics from both sides, both parties, but from the press as well.
Well,
Benjamin.
I can't sit silent. Oh, yes, I know. I have to say, I had rather a harder take on France than Mr. Adams. When you sent off your last attempt envoy to try to find a way to negotiate with the Directorate, well, honestly, I was all for a full-on declaration of war with France, but you wisely spoke me out of that. However, I think had I been with you in the capital city when you sent that envoy, at that point, we'd already been so insulted by the French. The diplomatic missions have been... Diplomats to negotiate with France were faced with... they were asked to give a loan to the United States.
Bribe.
The loan and then the bribe and a formal apology for having disrespected France and not come to their aid because we'd signed a treaty with a king who is now dead. Anyway, Mr. Adams tried again after that and asked the ambassador in the Netherlands at the time to go to Paris and attempt to negotiate. He was able to because Napoleon had just thrown over the Directorate, and so it was a whole new government again, and he managed to come up with that peace treaty. Unfortunately, too late for your re-election. But when news came out that Mr. Adams had sent that envoy, it was said about in the papers that many of those who were pushing war more had wished the old woman had been nearby, perhaps to take that decision-making down a peg or two. But I yield that that was the right move. You did manage to keep the country out of full war with France. Unfortunately, you just didn't get the recognition for it.
Indeed. And, you know, those Republicans, so enamored with France, despite the bloodshed of their revolution, far different from ours. Yes, we did fight a war, but we did not turn on our own people. And rather than punished by law, punished by death. I told them then that this would only be resolved by an unwise return to absolute rule, and that is precisely what happened, but it did work to our benefit.
Mrs. Adams, you were, what was it like to be the first, second lady, and then the first lady?
The first second lady and then the second first lady.
Yes.
Well played, sir. Well played.
Now, these are terms that weren't used at the time of Mr. Adams's presidency, but yes, the wife of the vice president and then the wife of the president, exhausting. There was a great deal of entertaining, even when Mr. Adams was vice president. In fact, I'm not certain if this is in your notes, but most of the time that John was vice president, I, in fact, stayed in Massachusetts just so we could save on our expenses. Because we were expected, if we had a household with a married couple in residence, to host teas and levees and a weekly, every Wednesday night dinner for 16 people. Remember? We picked up that habit from Mrs. Washington and continued it into the presidency as well. But there was it was terribly expensive, of course. You know, many of these other officials, Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Washington, Mr. Madison, they've vast estates, great generational wealth, and Mr. Adams, your father was a deacon and a shoemaker, and my father was another town parson, and we'd done our best to be frugal and kept ourselves out of debt, which is not something Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison would say.
In Europe as well. I think it would have taken the Spanish Armada to bring everything back that Mr. Jefferson bought in France.
But after about a year of being the wife of the vice president and having to deal with all of these social hostings and gatherings, we opted for me to stay in Quincy while John... First you were going to take a room in a boarding house, and then...
Perhaps a bit hasty.
I think it was the Secretary of State's house that
was.
a room was offered in
It was.
another respectable person's house, because the vice president shouldn't be taking a room in a boarding house. But it was a good way to save money. As far as following in Mrs. Washington's footsteps, she was a model of what to do with the position. Such grace in receiving. You see, the duty of a wife in a partnership of this sort, of course, partnerships, some elements are going to be the same whether you're a shoemaker or a parson or whether you're the president of the United States. There's elements of your marital spouse relationship that would remain the same regardless, but to be expected to be the domestic face of this man of business, to be the one presenting him to the public. And during your presidency, I did take care of your reputation in many ways.
You did indeed, and you're also very good at listening at the table to see what others were saying that I couldn't hear. Always important for a president.
Then there is a sad note, 1799, President Washington passes. Mr. Adams, you took that very sadly, with great sympathy, expressing your loss to the Senate.
Of course.
I believe your comment to the Senate was, "I feel myself alone, bereaved by loss of a brother."
Indeed. Well, let us just think back to him and how much he meant. We would not have a country without him. Before France joining us as an ally, everything was on his shoulders. And when he became Commander-in-Chief, he wrote to me of what his powers were, and I told him they were whatever he thought them to be, that he was the Commander-in-Chief and that he ought to do what he thought best. And it was for him that those men fought. Because very often the Congress could not pay the soldiers, could not equip them, could not feed them. It was for General Washington alone that they fought. And then I think we can all agree that though Mr. Jefferson and I were in Europe, our Constitution was drafted and finally approved with him in mind as what the executive should be. And he set all precedents. It was daunting, but I was an admirer. I just wish he would have consulted me a little more as president. But he meant so much, and still does, to the people of this country, sir.
Right. For those who knew him personally, and for those, everyone, really, I'm sure you must have noticed all of the George Washington mourning paraphernalia that's flooded the markets, pitchers and handkerchiefs, and all of the decorative pewter spoons with George Washington's face on it, and all of that. But there was such a feeling of the end of an era with the passing of Mr. Washington. Of course, it being December of 1799, just mere weeks later, as people throughout the country are learning about the passing of the former president, it is dawning onto this new century. We have a new president who is not George Washington, and we are embarking into this who knows of the 19th century.
I just wish I had his reserve. My lack of reserve has gotten me into trouble from my earliest days.
There are good times and there are sad times. The year 1800 was certainly the most difficult time for your family. Mr. Adams, you lost presidency. Unfortunately, your son Charles passed. It's almost too sad to talk about, but would you like to make a comment?
I will leave that to you, Mrs. Adams.
Or not?
Charles was no man's enemy but his own. As a boy, we both remarked frequently how very deeply he felt things. Very sensitive child, tender in a way that the others might not have been quite as much. And as a young man, he had been quite a difficulty as well, getting himself into quite a deal of trouble at Harvard. And then we were quite pleased when just a few years ago he found his Sally, started
Indeed.
a family. I thought that she was a saving grace of sorts, a safe harbor for a very sense-driven soul. But he unfortunately made some very unwise choices in business, failed his wife and daughters in a great way.
His brother.
And his brothers. And unfortunately, when he took ill in the year 1800, he was living alone. Sally and her daughters were living with our daughter Nabby and her children, and Charles was turned out of the house. He had a terrible jaundice and a fever and was quite ill. I visited him on my way down to Capital City, our first time going into Washington City, to an unfinished house, the presidential mansion. But on my way down, I stopped and visited, and could tell he was not long for this world. And unfortunately, it was just a short time later that we received the news, both that Charles had passed and also that, as we had suspected, Mr. Adams would not be returning for a second administration in the presidency.
Thank you
For the
sincerely for
inauguration.
sharing that. Mr. Adams, regarding your presidency, you're noted for peaceful transfer of the
Yes.
presidency.
Yes.
Among your other great qualities, that this is the first time the presidency had transferred from one person to another, and it was unique in the sense that it was a peaceful transfer of power.
And in the beginning, even Benjamin Franklin Bache of the Aurora, a sworn enemy, even had good things to say, if you can imagine that. The grandson of the good doctor. I can remember the inauguration day without my family. Unfortunately, Mrs. Adams had not been up to join me yet. Walking in, and Mr. Jefferson had already been sworn in as vice president. And I remember President Washington, 6 foot and a great deal, outgoing president. Vice President Jefferson, 6 foot and a great deal, incoming vice president. And where am I at these days? Perhaps 5'8" on a good day. And then President Adams in a suit very much like this, very plain. I believe it was gray, my suit was that day. And I gave them my plan in my inauguration. My plan was that we must be very wary of sophistry, meaning lies being spread, meaning the newspapers, party politics, and European affairs, that we needed to be very careful of all of them. And I spent a great deal of my 4 years as president dealing with all three in equal measure. And being called names in the newspaper, the things you have to endure as president. Fat, bald, toothless Adams.
Politics has not changed.
And as far as peaceful transition out of your presidency, let it not be said that Mr. Adams left the capital city in a huff and didn't stay for Mr. Jefferson's inauguration for any sort of personal reasons. I simply wanted him home, and he had to catch the stagecoach to Baltimore very early in the morning.
Thank you. Another myth dispelled. I did not stomp into the coach and hurry them off at the quick step and get those horses in full gallop out of town. It was when the stage left.
That's it.
And I was needed at home. And there's no precedent. Although Mr. Jefferson was there, and as vice president for mine, but of course, how could President Washington outgoing not be at my inauguration? But there were different circumstances entirely.
Yes, yes. Mrs. Adams, would you like to take a few questions from the audience?
Well, certainly. I tend to listen a great deal and then express myself to Mr. Adams.
It is true.
So, you'll have to stop me if I take the liberty of being able to speak in response, but certainly, if anyone has questions of me.
Would you stand, please, and
Your
speak?
handwriting is so beautiful.
Oh.
How did you learn penmanship? What did you do to perfect it?
Writing endlessly. I can guarantee you, when I first picked up a quill, my handwriting wasn't nearly as good as you might have seen it now. Yes, as I mentioned, it was my grandmother who did most of my early schooling, so she taught me to manage a quill and a pen and write endlessly. Of course, the writing was not always lengthy letters to begin with. It was copying verses or nursery rhymes or little catechisms, things like that. But yeah, early practice. I should like to say that if my handwriting is beautiful, as you might think, it certainly comes from many, many, many years and many, many, many letters out of his hand.
Literally thousands. Literally thousands. Another question?
Not a question, but a comment. I feel you were a woman ahead of your time when you wrote the letter to your husband regarding what you hoped they would include regarding women. Little did you know that 250 years later, many women would be doing the same.
Indeed. The future you wish for, madam.
Well,
Mr.
And I do as well. I do as well.
I want to, you
Yes, please.
presented this as questions, and I do want to follow that up. I have to say, I know not what comes 250 years from now, but I can say that in the last few decades, since the beginning of the revolution, or even before in my girlhood, when girls were limited to such a small amount of education, it's still not offered to everyone, but so many more young women are being offered an education, and thus that potential of anything they might become is so much grander than it ever had been before.
Thank you. Mr. Adams, would you like to take a question or two from?
Certainly. I was thinking that you were going to tell me not to interrupt Mrs. Adams. Yes, certainly. And you could even mention the poor wretch that lost his life this summer.
Mr. Hamilton.
Anyone? Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could shed some clarity on the Benedict Arnold situation. Since you were before the revolution, during, and after, he was so courageous in the battles that he fought.
Indeed.
And certainly we'd have been in tough shape if he hadn't done that, and him and the people that were with him. And then we read where he's been passed over many times for different things, and then at the end he turns into a traitor. And do you think that the circumstances that why he was passed over had anything to do with him going the other way?
Well, there were suspicions, but I will not say, as I chaired the Board of War and Ordnance, that everything went perfectly, that we made the right decision all of the time. I have known good men that have been passed over in rank from then till now, but no one quite like General Arnold. You are most right. If not for General Arnold saving the day at Freeman's Farm, we might not have had that victory, and without that victory, we might not have gained the French as an ally. My point that I would make about General Arnold is that the struggle for independence was a long and difficult journey. Not everything is going to go as a general or as whoever you are involved in it is going to go your way. You will get passed over in rank. You will lose an argument in Congress. You might lose a battle or a skirmish on the battlefield. But regardless of rank, regardless of money, regardless of being passed over for something, you must remember what is most important. What is more important? Your rank or serving your country? I gave up a great deal to go to Europe. It is not the same sort of thing. We are talking of different fruits. But I left my family behind to cross over to the Atlantic twice. At great sacrifice to my law practice, to my time in Congress, but most importantly to my family. And I did it for the cause. We negotiated, debated in that Congress to declare our independence. There were things left out of that declaration which should be there, and I think we know what one in particular is, regarding slavery. But without compromise, we could not have gotten the Declaration of Independence written and then finally confirmed and independence passed. So if I could have spoken to General Arnold, if I had known then what I know now, I would have told him, your courage, sir, will be remembered. All of the slights will come out in history. We are readers of history, Mrs. Adams, are we not? It will all come to light, and you will be remembered as a hero instead of a traitor if you stay true. I wish I could have said that to him.
Now, you certainly had George Washington's ear. What was his take on all of that happening? The refusals of promotion and stuff.
What did General Washington think? Well, that I cannot tell you. A very reserved man, and though I would get reports from General Washington, of course, he got himself in trouble in Philadelphia when he was placed there in command by, let us just say, making himself more wealthy than he needed to be. That got him in a great deal of trouble. And I think what you might mean is the company that he was keeping. Also, people talk, do they not, sir? And I'm sure word got back to General Washington of his behavior in Philadelphia. And there were reprimands and there was punishment. But he should have stayed true.
True.
And then to wear the uniform of the other side. Outrageous. There is no coming back from that.
No.
Yes. Mrs. Adams, would you like to make any final comments to the audience?
Oh, pressure is enormous. Well, I've already started down this road, and I'll try to keep it brief and try not to repeat myself ever so much, but educate everyone young, educate everyone old, keep the education going, be they male, female, of any color. If you hold an education back from somebody, you are stopping them from becoming the great things that might come, and you are, it's an act of cowardice to stop that. If you want learned statesmen and heroes, then you need to have educated people. That's what I'll leave you with.
Indeed. And it is in our Constitution.
Mr. Adams, any final words to the audience?
Have we another hour? No, certainly not. No, I would echo that. It is why when I wrote Thoughts on Government on the eve of our declaring our independence, I provided for education for all. And when I drafted the Constitution for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, when I came home from my first time in France and was home with my family once again, that I provided for education once again. Because education makes us all better citizens, does it not? And less prone to such things as sophistry and party politics and
Falling victim to sophistry.
indeed. So I would echo Mrs. Adams' true words. And to believe in our form of government, because it is indeed the finest form of government that there is. And it has its faults, and it has its weaknesses, but it is still the best one. And we are the great test as to whether it will survive or not. And that depends on all of you.
Well,
Thank you.